That was the first few bars of a song called It's a Lover's Question by Clyde McPhatter. My parents, in fact, were very fond of that song around the time they were married, about 1960, and it was, very well known at the time. But Clyde McPhatter, for those of you who don't know, was the foundation of modern day rhythm and blues and soul singing by being among the first to combine gospel, the flavor of gospel music, with popular rhythm and blues, which was the foundation of the type of singing that was later made popular by two young men who he befriended and mentored, Jackie Wilson and Sam Cooke. Unfortunately, Clyde McPhatter never received the accolades he deserved as the other two men did, and he died, unfortunately, in poverty in 1972, but he was later elected to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame around 1987. And he was also from Durham, North Carolina. This is Damon Fordham, an adjunct professor of history, as well as an author and historian and storyteller. And what you're about to hear are some interesting stories of black people in North Carolina. I was moved to do this when I spoke to a young lady from Sampson County, North Carolina, a place called Clinton. And she was telling me how she wished that North Carolina blacks had a history as interesting as the black people of South Carolina. Guess what? They do. And so this video is about some of them. Now, during the days of slavery, we get the image that a lot of black people in those days were hopelessly illiterate. Well, part of the reason they were illiterate was because they were forced to be illiterate. They were not allowed to learn to read or write. Why? Because, get this, when you're a slave, when you start reading and learning and such, you begin to get these ideas like freedom and justice and equality and hope, which of course the slave masters didn't want. Well, one such individual who was literate was a free black man born in Wilmington, North Carolina, by the name of David Walker, who was best remembered for writing David Walker's Appeal in 1829. By that time, he was born in Wilmington, and he learned how to read in many of the underground schools that they had for African Americans in those days, which is an interesting story in itself. And he made his way to Charleston around the time of the Denmark-Vesey Rebellion, then finally up to North Carolina, where he married and had a son. He was also involved in many early black organizations in Boston, and because he was well-read, he read the Declaration of Independence, he read the Constitution, he read the Bible, and he read history, and all of that led to the writing of David Walker's Appeal, where he fused all of these teachings in a call for African Americans to stand up and demand their freedom. Here's an example of this. Let's see. I have heard that when I look over these United States of America and the world and see the ignorant deceptions and consequent wretchedness of my brethren, I am brought oftentimes solemnly to a stand, and in the midst of my reflections I explain to my God, Lord, why did I make us to be slaves to our brethren the whites? But when I reflect that God is just and that my millions of my wretched brethren would meet death with glory, yea, more, would plunge into the very mouths of cannons and be torn into particles as minute as the atoms which compose the elements of the earth, in preference to a mean submission to a lash of tyrants. I am with streaming eyes compelled to shrink back into nothingness before my Maker and exclaim again, Thy will be done, O Lord God Almighty. So much for ignorance. Well, along with David Walker, about the same time he was doing his thing, was another African American in around the Chapel Hill area of North Carolina. His name was George Moses Horton, and during slavery, he also somehow learned how to read. But not only did he do that, he was often brought to do chores around the University of North Carolina, around Chapel Hill. And he began to read and recite poetry that he wrote. And obviously, when he learned to read, he read some pretty high-power, articulate things. He was actually the first African American in the South to write a book on poetry, as a matter of fact. And here's some examples from it. From 1829, it was a book that he wrote that was called The Hope of Liberty. And listen to some of this. Alas, am I born for this, to wear this slavish chain, deprived of all created bliss through hardship, toil, and pain? How long have I in bondage lain, in languish to be free? Alas, and must I still complain, deprived of liberty? O heaven, and is there no relief this side of the silent grave, to soothe the pain, to quell the grief and anguish of a slave? Come, liberty, thou cheerful wound, roll through my ravaged ears. Come, let my grief and joys be drowned, and drive away my fears. Now, isn't that amazing? Yeah, that was George Moses Horton who wrote this in 1829. Well, fortunately, he lived to not only publish his books, but he also lived to see emancipation before his death in 1883, when he was said to be somewhere around 100 years old or so. So after slavery, you had a number of North Carolinians who continued this fight for freedom, and one of the most interesting took place once again in Wilmington. There was Alexander Manley, who had a newspaper called the Wilmington Record, and on August the 18th, 1898, he wrote about a lady by the name of Mrs. Rebecca Fulton, who wrote an article saying that African American men should be lynched on grounds of rape and molestation and so forth, and that this had to be done to keep African Americans in control. Well, in his newspaper, the Wilmington Record, Alexander Manley, who's shown, let's see if we can get this right, that's him right there. This is what he had to say on that subject, or part of it. Let's see. We suggest that the whites guard their women more closely, as Miss Felton says, thus giving no opportunity for the human fiend, be he white or black. You leave your goods out of doors and then complain because they are taken away. Poor white men are careless in the matter of protecting their women, especially on the farms. They are careless of their conduct toward them, and our experience teaches us that the women of that race are not any more particular in the matter of clandestine meetings with colored men than are the white men with colored women. Meetings of this kind go on for some time until the women's infatuation or the man's boldness bring attention to them, and the man is lynched for rape. Every Negro lynched is called a big, burly black brute, when in fact many of those who have thus been dealt with have had white men for their fathers, and not only not black and burly, but were sufficiently attractive for white girls of culture and refinement to fall in love with them, as is very well known to all. Mrs. Felton must begin at the fountainhead if she wishes to purify the stream. Teach your men purity. Let virtue be not something more than an excuse for them to intimidate and torture helpless people. Teach your men that it is no worse for a black man to be intimate with a white woman than for a white man to be intimate with a colored woman. Whoa. That was strong stuff for 1898. And Benjamin Ryan Tillman, the architect of Jim Crow laws in South Carolina, came up to Wilmington and asked the people of Wilmington, are y'all going to let that so-and-so talk to you about your white women like this? And he basically encouraged violence against that. And so, unfortunately, in November of 1898, a mob led by Colonel Alfred Waddell came into Wilmington and basically destroyed the black section of town, destroyed Mr. Manley's newspaper, burned the printing press, shot a lot of African Americans until they fled into the woods. And up to that point, Wilmington had a largely interracial government with blacks on the police force and in the city council and so forth. But after Colonel Waddell and his men took them over, they were all forced out of office with Colonel Waddell's followers. But I'll tell you this, though, they didn't just sit back and cower over this. Mr. Manley went on to Philadelphia, where he continued as a journalist, and two ministers from Wilmington, a Reverend J. Allen Kirk out of Central Baptist Church and a Reverend Charles Norris, both wrote very strong articles against what happened, and even included not only their names, but the names of those who were involved. And Reverend Charles Norris, as a matter of fact, this is what he had to say on the subject in Philadelphia in January of 1899, after he escaped in the Wilmington Massacre, and talked about what he saw. The Good Samaritan did not leave his eldest son robbed and bleeding at his own threshold while he went way off the road between Jerusalem and Jericho to hunt for a man that had fallen among thieves. Nor can America afford to go 8,000 miles from home to set up a Republican government in the Philippines while the blood of citizens whose ancestors came here before the Mayflower, are crying out to God against her from the gutters of Wilmington. These people were no joke. And I would be remiss if I not mention one of the great women in particular of North Carolina, Miss Charlotte Hawkins Brown, who was born in 1883 in rural North Carolina, I believe in Henderson. And she spent a lot of her childhood in Massachusetts, where she became very refined and ladylike. But in spite of her good fortunes, she managed to return to North Carolina in Salina, North Carolina, about 1902 to begin the Palmer Memorial Institute, not too far from Greensboro. And she began that school in a rural part of North Carolina at a time when many rural people couldn't read or write. But yet, she managed to overcome the racism of the time, to build this institute into one of the top institutions for African Americans. And even after she died in 1961, the school continued to flourish until it burned in 1971. And today, there's a museum dedicated to Miss Brown and her school, and her story in this book, Charlotte Hawkins Brown, One Woman's Dream by Diane Silcox Jarrett, is a very inspiring read, especially for young girls who face a lot of difficulties in their life. Then, from Sampson County, North Carolina, you had John Merrick. John Merrick, who was born in slavery in 1859. He managed to learn and read and write from the Bible. But not only did he do that, he became a barber, and he learned how to conduct business very well. As a matter of fact, as a brick mason, he also helped to build Shaw University up in Raleigh, North Carolina, an African-American school. But anyway, in Durham, he managed to not only become a successful barber, he became successful in a number of other businesses, especially in what would become the city's Little Haiti section. And he, along with C.C. Spalding and several others, formed one of the biggest African-American businesses in North Carolina during the 20th century that still exists today, the North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company. And as a matter of fact, what John Merrick did was the foundation of one of the best black business districts in the southern United States at that time period. In fact, the great sociologist E. Franklin Frazier wrote about it in The New Negro, an anthology by Elaine Locke in 1925. He included a chapter on all of this called Durham, the Capital of the Black Middle Class. It was called Black Wall Street, pretty much the same way as you had the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, only with a different result. And finally, people talk about Malcolm X a great deal, but there was also a gentleman by the name of Robert F. Williams, who was from Monroe, North Carolina. Robert F. Williams was a Marine, as a matter of fact, fought in the Second World War, and he also was definitely a fighter not only in World War II, but also afterward. You see, there was a lot of police brutality and racism in in Monroe. So at one point, the Klan was harassing them in the 1950s. Well, he took out a charter for the National Rifle Association, and with a group of his friends, they formed the Black Guard in Monroe in 1957. And so when the Ku Klux Klan happened to come by and try to harass them in the neighborhood, Robert Williams and his followers came by with their rifles and went up to the Klan and said, "Hey, what are you guys doing there?" And they saw them with the guns and said, "Oh, nothing, sir, nothing at all." And so then they took the guns and went, "Then get the hell out of here." And they did. And he wrote about this in a number of his other adventures in a book called Negroes with Guns in 1962, which eventually became a handbook for groups later on, such as the Black Panther movement and others. And Robert Williams, incidentally, he was definitely a proponent of the issue of self-defense in the face of violence, and not, of course, random attacks or anything crazy like that. But still, though, the people of North Carolina need to know that they have a pretty strong history, too. And this goes for anyone listening to this. Wherever you have humans, you have a history. So study that history so you can be inspired. This is Damon Fordham.